Alright everybody, here's your demo on how to get started on your coil pitcher. Take a little handful of clay out of your bag, put the rest of it back in, and then you're going to start to create a patty of clay in your hand. So you're just kind of slapping it back and forth and kind of rotating as you go until you get about a half of an inch thick. You're going to use your sticks on your canvas and your rolling pin, and you're going to slowly and carefully roll out and back, lift and turn, out and back, lift and turn. Do that 3 or 4 times before you get to the point where you're the same thickness as the actual sticks. I'm going to flip it over one time to kind of finalize both sides and making sure that it's nice and uniform throughout. Now I got to prep the slab, so I'm going to use a little bit of water from my sponge, and I'm going to compress the clay with my rib. Just carefully, a couple passes on top, and then flip it over. Do the exact same thing on the other side. Once I've done that, I'm going to start planning for what size base I want to cut out. You can use any kind of shape you want. It could be square, rectangular, triangular, circle, oval. I'm going to use a stencil from a lid as my template kind of, and I'm going to cut it out very, very carefully with the needle tool. I want to use vertical line with my needle tool. I don't want to make an undercut underneath the slab, so I want to make sure that it has a nice clean edge to it. If I made an undercut, it'd make it a weak edge, and it might let the coil that you're trying to attach to it fall over the side. So try to keep your needle tool as vertical as possible. It's going to get stuck to the lid. Very lightly pry it open, and then it'll eventually peel off. Do not use the lid like a cookie cutter and try to forget about the step with the actual needle tool, because it'll get stuck inside the lid. Find yourself some newspaper, or maybe even some thin cardboard, maybe cardboard from a cereal box that you can use as your platform to work on. It'll allow you to actually rotate the clay without having to touch the clay, which is a good thing when you don't want to leave finger marks and stuff like that. Now I'm taking clay from my bag, and I'm going to compress it down into my coil. I'm slowly and lightly kind of turning the clay as I compress it with the fingers, and I'm going to use a tabletop that's not porous at first and try to make sure that I can use that to roll out my coils. If I have anything that starts to get a little uneven, I can twist both ends of my coil and then slowly kind of redirect the clay and making sure it stays nice and circular. I want to be able to roll the coil with my fingertips all the way to the wrist of my hands, or right to the wrists, and so that you can actually long kind of continuous strokes when you're rolling it out. So fingertips all the way to your wrist almost. As I'm rolling, I want to make sure the clay stays hydrated, so I want to wipe the clay a couple times with some water, and just to make sure that it doesn't crack on me when I start to bend the coil and use it for my actual coil building. I'm going to make another coil. Same technique as before. Compress it with your fingers over and over and over again in your hand. As you rotate, it'll start to slowly stretch out. And if I have any imperfections, I'm going to twist the ends. If you get any kind of clay that's kind of flopping because it's flat on one side, twist the ends in opposite directions and kind of make that spiral twist. Then compress again, and then roll out again on top of the actual tabletop. I'm using this area because I don't have a big enough tabletop to work on right now, so I'm using this area, which is actually the canvas area, so I want to make sure I keep hydrating the clay as I go. Work from the middle out to the edges and make sure it rotates properly, and then hydrate again once you feel like you have the right thickness. Usually what we're looking for is about the thickness of your ring finger, but some of you have pretty narrow fingers, so it might need to be the thickness of your thumb or something like that. But you want to make sure that the clay thickness is close to that on all your coils, because if you make it too thin, it's going to be very difficult to attach properly. If you make it too thick, it's going to make it too heavy. So you want to make sure that you've got a consistent coil that's close to your ring finger, or maybe your thumb, depending on whether you have really narrow fingers or not. Extra coils can be wrapped up in plastic so that they don't dry out while you're working on your first attachment. So now you've got your tabletop, you've got your paper, your newspaper, or maybe even the cut cereal box, and now I'm just kind of laying over my coil. I'm laying the coil right on top of the slab without any overhang. And I want to make it nice and clean with a nice diagonal cut, making sure it's the right size once I reattach it back there. There should be no overhang on top of this first attached area. You should not have an overhang over your slab. I'm going to slide the board underneath so it's easier for me to pick up so I don't alter the form, and try to show you guys a little bit about what it should look like before you start scoring and slipping it together. Take your slip, take your brush, make sure you keep cleaning out your stuff after you use it. Take your wire brush, and I'm just scoring the ends together, or scoring the ends so I can put them together. And just a little bit of slip, just enough to kind of fill in that void and start to be able to blend the clay so it has a nice strong connection. Remember, the angle cut is very important because you have more leverage to be able to compress the clay together instead of just a straight perpendicular cut with the coil. Test it again before you start to score all the surface. So now you're going to work your way around the edge of the slab, a crisscross pattern, kind of exit all over the place. Make sure you dig in deep enough that you're going to get a nice agitated surface, and do that on your coil as well. Once you've done that, you're going to take your slip and you're going to dab. Oh yeah, you want to make sure that you put your extra clay back in the bag. Dab the slip on top of the surface with your brush. Load up your brush so you don't have to keep going back and forth too many times. And then do the same thing on the coil. But you're dealing with very soft clay right now straight out of the bag, so you should be able to get away with a little less slip, but as long as it's pushing out around the edges, once you start compressing it back down, you'll be able to get a nice strong connection. Notice that I'm just trying to make sure that the coil is rotated in my hand. I'm not rotating my hand around the coil. So that's the purpose of having it on a piece of paper or a piece of cardboard as you work. It allows you to keep things a little bit more centered and symmetrical as you're building. The technique of actually compressing the coil down is you basically are going to kind of lightly grab the clay and then slide your thumb down every time and compress it into the previous layer. Always press the clay down into the previous layer. Don't slide your thumb up and away from the previous layer. Eventually that could cause the wall to crack during the drying process, and you can't fix it after that. So always compress down and slide your thumb over the connection over and over and over again as you go through it. So you'll start to see your wall blend together, and you start to see all the slip kind of pushing out at the seam and making sure you have a nice strong connection. Now that the clay is nice and soft, you can work your way around the inside edge and kind of smooth out the slip a little bit more and fill in all the gaps that you might still see after you've been compressing the clay down. Don't try to clean it up completely because there's going to be more to do. Each layer needs to be done the same way. And so I'm just measuring out again a new coil for the next layer. Same technique, and this is a technique you're going to repeat as you build your whole entire coil pitcher. Testing things out, make sure the circle is nice and placed in the right spot. Now if I want the clay to start to flare out, I'm going to make my ring, my coil ring, just a tad bigger than the previous layer. If I want my walls to start to go back in, I want to make my ring just a tad smaller than the previous layer. Make sure you get your clay wrapped up that you don't need. Put it back in the bag so you can use it for later. And then repeat the process of scoring and slipping the ends together, and then blending them in well, making sure they don't fall apart when you're starting to put the walls up. And then also make sure that wherever your connection is for each ring, try not to overlap or stack right on top of the previous layer where the ring was attached. So you want to make sure you kind of stagger each of those little seams that you've created when you put the coils together. Score the entire surface again. And then slip. Make sure you cover the entire surface with slip. If you brush back and forth, you're going to ruin your texture. So you want to make sure you dab the clay, not brush when you have the slip. Slowly working my way around, and then I'm going to use my other hand with my thumb just below on that previous layer to make sure that this first coil doesn't push out and get deformed from the pressure of putting the new coil on top of it. So you need to support the wall as you do this every time, inside and outside, to make sure that the wall stays in the spot that you want it to be. Try to make sure your hand is staying in the same area, and then you're kind of rotating your clay within your hand instead of the opposite where you're actually rotating your hand around the clay. Keep the clay kind of rotating in your hand and keep your hand steady in one spot most of the time. So now I'm just kind of working on getting that thumb pressure to slide down over the surface and really starting to make sure that that seam is starting to blend in really well. And you can see how I'm kind of switching back and forth between both hands, just trying to make it work depending on which direction I want the clay to go. If I want to start flaring it out, I'll start to press just a little bit harder on the inside and kind of making the clay stretch. And then to guarantee a good connection between the coils, good practice is to make sure that you brush at a diagonal kind of direction down into the surface of both coils and then blend it back together with your fingers. So you shouldn't see any seam lines on the inside at all. The inside is going to hold your entire piece together because that's the part that's not going to get touched and removed later when you want to remove some of the weight. And so that's the starting point. After that, we're going to keep going. Thanks.